Sisters were intrepid gold diggers. Now Hidden History features the women of the gold rush.
It was 1848, the wake of the Irish famine. Waves of emigrants were sailing to America when news came of a gold strike in California. The human stampede that followed would bring mixed fortunes to those who made the dangerous journey west. And once the California strike ran dry, rumors of silver in the Arizona desert, copper in the mountains of Montana, and gold in Alaska's frozen Klondike drew thousands of Irish panning rich dreams.
In the history of the American West, nothing was more important than mining. And the big mining started parallel with the real troubles in Ireland. No other group of people were there in such numbers. No other group that came to the United States had such a high percentage of females.
For ordinary Irish women, times were harsh. Farms were left to men, paid work was scarce, and marriage meant years of bearing children. Hope lay in America. For three pioneering Irish women, the Klondike Gold Rush of 1898 brought freedom, the kind they could only dream of back home. It was a golden opportunity for adventure that would bring vast wealth to some and tragedy to others. For Nellie Cashman, America brought years of migratory prospecting. From Arizona to Alaska, she followed the gold trail before settling down to a life of solitude, mining near the Arctic Circle. For entrepreneur Belinda Mulrooney, the frontier offered the opportunity to make millions before losing most to a con man with pretensions to aristocracy. And then there was Molly Walsh, a laundry worker and mining camp follower, perhaps even a prostitute. When Molly tried to escape the violent goldfields, she was hounded down the Pacific coast to a tragic end. Nellie Cashman was the first to leave Ireland. Her family were already taking gambles when they went to America in the 1850s.
Well, Nellie's family was from Middleton near Queenstown. Her father died, and the widow had two daughters, Nellie and her sister, Fanny. And they decided to try their luck in the New World. And they went to Boston, where they lived for some years.
Nellie worked in a Boston hotel, but it was clear the young woman had greater ambitions.
I was a bellhop in Boston when I met President Ulysses S. Grant. when I told him I wanted to do things because I had to live, he said, "Why don't you go west, young woman? The West needs people like you." Well, we'd gone west when we left Ireland, and I certainly didn't plan to spend the rest of my days working as an Irish servant girl.
For Nellie, the West meant San Francisco, a mining hub since the gold rush days of the 1840s.
So this is where people would come and go, supplies, manufacturers, the equipment was created there, and Nellie was in the midst of this for several years, and it just got to be very interesting to her.
When Nellie left San Francisco, it was on the Silver Trail to Nevada. To support her dream of mining, she lodged prospectors in the desert town of Pioche.
Pioche ranks high if you're looking for violent episodes. Duels, fistfights, brawls of all kinds, arrests. Mining communities are very selective for young single men, and so almost always when you see a mining community, it's a pretty tough place.
Those miners were a rough lot, but they were good men, and if the silver vein had not begun to pinch out, I might have been there till I died. But that's the way it is with mining. Just when you don't expect it, you strike it rich. And then, when you think you're about to become a silver queen, the vein peters out and you hear that there's a big new strike in Alaska or some other godforsaken place.
In 1877, a gold strike in the Cassiar district of Alaska pushed Nellie northward. As winter closed in, news reached Nellie that a group of miners had been stranded inside the vast interior.
So she gathered together 4 or 5 people, and she led this rescue team through horrible snow and cold conditions, coming at near death many, many times, and finally, through her leadership, was able to bring these dog teams and loads of supplies into the starving camp, and that's what saved 3 or 4 dozen people from death that winter.
By 1881, Nellie was living in Tombstone, Arizona, running a restaurant to finance her passion for prospecting. Tombstone was a mining boomtown made famous by Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and the legendary gunfight at the OK Corral.
The famous shootout in Tombstone of the Earp boys and Doc Holliday, etc., was in 1881. And Nellie's restaurant was a place that would be frequented by these people when they were not playing cards, boozing, or doing whatever they do in places like that. Okay? So in other words, she was an intimate associate.
I get a big laugh these days with all the nonsense about Wyatt Earp and the others. They weren't bad fellas, but most of them had to fight it out to keep ahead of the game.
While in Tombstone, Nellie's sister died, leaving the care of her 6 children solely to Nellie.
To inherit a son or a daughter of a deceased sibling is one thing, but to have 6 of them is quite a challenge, but as usual, she was up to it.
We think about generic pioneer women, but even when we do, we see them pictured with children and a husband. And in fact, the most entrepreneurial women, the most adventurous women went on their own and carved out a life for themselves and showed how you could live in the wilderness and make a culture of your own there.
For Nellie, part of making that culture was investing most of her money into the frontier community.
Wherever she was, She had a major input to the establishment of hospitals and churches, sometimes schools. The money didn't come from nowhere. It was part of the process, the earnings from her many gold and silver operations.
Then, in the autumn of 1897, news came of a gold strike on the banks of the Klondike River in Alaska's Yukon Territory. Nellie, now in her 50s and with her family reared, was determined to head north once again.
Going to Alaska? Well, I should say I am.
The stampede north to the Klondike Gold would eventually see over 100,000 men and women risk their lives. Only half would make it.
They all began coming in response to the fact that you could walk out and with your hands scoop up hundreds of dollars worth of gold and in a day make $1,000.
In the 1890s, there was a big depression in the U.S., and it especially hit the western U.S. Women were out of work as well as everyone else. And so many women got the idea then that they could pursue what they had already been doing, cooking or running boarding houses, and make far more money in the Klondike. And so many single women went.
One of the first to hear of the gold strike was Belinda Mulrooney. Belinda's parents had emigrated from County Sligo shortly after her birth in 1872. They had left Belinda behind with her grandmother and young uncles.
You can just imagine what it would be like for a 2-year-old suddenly to have the mother sort of disappear, and how would you understand that as a 2-year-old? And I think for Belinda, what she ended up doing was sort of fortifying herself with other relationships.
What I learned from my uncles was useful later in Alaska, to know that a woman around men who couldn't do her share was a nuisance and left behind. And that's why I tried always to lead.
But Belinda's American journey took her to a grim coal mining town in Pennsylvania, and what greeted her was a family of strangers.
Well, what a shock. Certainly in the area that Belinda went to, it was highly industrialized in the sense that everything was aimed at getting this coal out of the ground. So there was machinery and all sorts of loud noises. Belinda hated it from the minute that she got there.
It was the dirtiest hole in the world. I didn't like my family or the coal dust. I couldn't get used to all those people. I had only one idea from the first, to find enough money to get out. So I dressed as a boy and gathered scrap coal and sold it for 60 cents a ton. And I saved every cent.
5 years later, aged only 20, Chicago's 1893 World's Fair was Belinda's ticket out.
Chicago, at that time, is a very dynamic place to be. The Columbian Exposition was transforming a whole area of southern Chicago into this magnificent, idealized, modern world.
Belinda's new passion was construction. She loved the girders and skyscrapers raising the skyline of America's big cities. She opened a bakery to support property deals and even leased land to house America's newest thrill, the Ferris wheel.
She's learning about hiring people to do work that you don't particularly want to do yourself. These are all skills that are going to be really important to her through the rest of her life, because these are the ones that allow her to be such a successful entrepreneur.
But Chicago also had its criminal element, with one incident testing Belinda's mettle and pushing her towards San Francisco.
One night, a gang of thieves came down the street. I knew the money was downstairs and a pistol with it. On the other side of the door, I saw a man trying to break in. I was so scared that my pistol rattled over the glass, and he ran. Oh my God, what excitement!
For Molly Walsh, excitement was a distant dream after the drudgery of domestic work in St. Paul, Minnesota.
It's really not known when Molly Walsh's parents came to the United States. Molly, at 12 years of age, went to work in a laundry. The family worked as laborers, barbers, painters.
When word of a mining boom in Montana reached Molly, she headed west like many Irish. Butte was a rough town full of drinking and brawling. There are even rumors that Molly was drawn to Butte's dance halls, a journey further than her Catholic background would normally allow. To survive, a woman's independence and reputation were hard to keep.
Butte, full of smoke, soot, poverty, prostitution, a town that was tired, decadent. Men slept in cribs for 8 hours and then went to work for 12 or 18. In the meantime, another man went to sleep in the same bed. It was a hellacious environment with a center for prostitution 3 blocks square, with women who were locked into cribs, and they were locked away there for months or until they died, with food served to them through windows. It's hard to assess the rumors of how Molly was able to get on in life. She was very clever, attractive, something special. And it's hard to think that she succumbed to living that kind of life, because once one entered it, there's no going back.
For the 3 Irish women, independence was hard won. And when gold was discovered on the Klondike River, that same independence pushed each of them to take a gamble.
A lot of people have tried to write about the 1890s and the turn of the century as if middle-class women were in their homes and the proper place for a woman was at her husband's side at home taking care of the children. But the Irish women never fell into that category because they all worked. They all had to make their own living, and they knew that from the moment that they got to America. So it's not that surprising that they would go to the Klondike, or at least a few of them, seeing that as a place where if they worked hard, they would truly be able to aspire to getting rich.
Belinda Mulrooney's San Francisco gamble hadn't paid off. She was now earning her living as the first woman to steward cargo ships on the Pacific route to Alaska.
There was something about the sea and ships I just loved, and Alaska fascinated me. I'd a knack for sailing up and down the coast, everything from a cow to a canary. I outfitted squaws with bridal dresses and picture hats. You'd sure get your money's worth if you saw them dressed up when I was through with them.
Belinda knew the isolated Klondike miners would pay for rich pickings. She put all her money into luxury goods and headed for the gold fields. As one of the first stampeders across Alaska into the Canadian Yukon, the route was treacherous.
We went over that lousy trail and everyone had to pull their weight. To climb Chilkoot Pass, you took a hand axe and cut each step out of the ice, carrying stuff on your back. In bad places, you strung a rope and climbed like that. I picked 6 good dogs and trained them to pack with little pockets of freight.
She would pull her own goods. She would do everything in order to make sure that they got through to Dawson as fast as possible, because you see, time was also important here. If you were going to stake a claim, it was better if you got there ahead of whatever rush there was going to be.
I ditched corsets, which was a rash thing to do. But the skirts were whalebone around the waist and made a good substitute. I suffered a lot from the whalebone.
Women wore skirts all the time. It was really considered impolite, improper to wear pants. But in a way, I think skirts might not have been so difficult, although they all describe cutting off their skirts probably around mid-calf length, which itself was considered improper. But nevertheless, they often did that for the trip over the Chilkoot Trail itself.
Relaying was endless. Such a small percentage made the summit. A great many returned snowblind or homesick. After placing our camp, I got to buying supplies from the disheartened people who turned back.
As you head up into the mountains and passing the glaciers, it looks like the end of the world. And then from there, even if you could get a horse to carry your goods, you still had to walk yourself. And it was about a 2-week hike over to the lakes. And when you got to the lakes, you could build a boat and float down the Yukon for 500 or 700 miles. So it was a terrifically difficult trip. Only the most adventurous people went.
Travelling from Butte, Molly Walsh met an Irish Presbyterian minister, the Reverend Robert Dickey. Perhaps hoping to start a new life, Molly joined Dickey's church in Skagway. The minister remembers Molly as one of the prettiest girls in the congregation.
Molly had no love of money for herself. She only wanted to give her mother the great desire of her life, a trip to the Paris Exposition.
Skagway was a thriving port near the mountain trails into the Yukon. A boom town, it was under the control of an outlaw, Soapy Smith. Smith ran lucrative extortion and prostitution rackets.
Reverend Dickey tells a story of how a friend of Molly Walsh's was dying in a house of prostitution and how she asked Reverend Dickey to go to the girl who, although Catholic, would appreciate some benediction and ministering to in her hour of need. Reverend Dickey does go, and thereafter ensues a kind of grassroots movement between Molly and Reverend Dickey that causes a number of the prostitutes to reform.
Molly had known pimps like Smith back in Butte. What she hadn't reckoned on was the fury unleashed when she interfered in his business.
Soapy Smith ran a gang of criminals, anywhere from 100 to 200 strong. People would turn up floating dead face down in the harbor, and no one would know how they met their ends. There can be no doubt that he put out a contract on her to have her removed.
Despite clear danger, Molly went to nurse a prostitute who was dying.
We were surprised to hear of Molly nursing one of the unfortunates of the bawdy house. She had known the ailing woman from home. Molly would risk everything when a sick girl needed her.
To escape Soapy Smith, Molly Walsh decided to march up the trail some 35 miles.
But escape from Soapy Smith only pushed Molly into the arms of a new threat. By the summer of 1898, Nellie Cashman, Belinda Mulrooney, and Molly Walsh were all in sight of Alaska's Klondike goldfields. Nellie Cashman reveled in the journey up Chilkoot Pass.
There were 3 ways to get to the gold country, and none of them were easy. And it was complicated because you're in United States territory, but you're going into Canadian territory. You had to have a certain amount of provisions. You had to last a certain number of days. In other words, the Canadian authorities didn't want a bunch of people wandering around who couldn't even take care of themselves. So Nellie is faced with getting this sled that had enough food, supplies, blankets, etc., that when she reached the end, weeks later, it would satisfy the Canadian authorities.
There's a story written by another Klondiker who met Nellie on the trail, who says that Nellie went in early and did not take the ton of goods, was dressed in men's clothing, apparently bribed the Mounties, although I'm sure the people in Canada would not like to hear that. So she did that in order to get in early to Dawson before the main part of the rush. She was shunned on the trail by this party of miners because they did not know if women were, honest women or prostitutes, although she must have been in her 50s by then, but she camped near these men on the trail.
It takes real folks to live by themselves in the land of the North. Of course, there are rascals everywhere, but up north there's a kindly feeling. It takes the solitude of frozen nights and the glistening fairness of days to bring out the soul in folks.
Nellie Cashman camps alone on account of her sex. Undaunted in the wilderness, she surmounts all the obstacles nature beset her.
For Belinda Mulrooney, the majesty of the North was overwhelming.
The beauty of Alaska. You can't overdo it. It seems that every day is different. You just feast on it. You become quite religious, get inspiration. It might be the electricity in the air, but you're filled with it.
Belinda had arrived in Dawson City a whole season before the main stampede. At nearby El Dorado Creek, gold was being pulled out of the earth in fistfuls. Belinda began selling silk and hot water bottles. Next, she built houses and opened a hotel and restaurant, all the while investing in new mining claims.
A lot of these people were quite wealthy. They had been mining all winter. They wanted something to spend their money on, and here Belinda was providing with something that wasn't available anywhere else. So they bought it up. She made a 600% profit in just a matter of a couple weeks, sold out everything.
The reason I started so many hotels was because I was never a woman to be married to a cook stove. I learned a lot about the conditions of the country that way. When the men came to eat, I used to sit and listen. During the first winter, I secured 3 claims in El Dorado and 10 from new strikes. I didn't pay much.
The men spent all their money on booze. When they got tired of that, Belinda had the restaurant in her Fairview Hotel where she had imported linen tablecloths, real silver, a chef from San Francisco. The bartender was from Los Angeles. She determined to make this a first-class experience, and you could spend as much money as you wanted on a dinner at her hotel.
Nellie Cashman also ran a restaurant while prospecting the creeks. She catered for ordinary miners and men down on their luck.
I didn't make a fortune, because if a fella was broke and hungry, sure, I'd give him a meal for nothing.
Soon Nellie's claims were bringing in the gold. She found the work tough but fulfilling.
Now, to get the gold on the Klondike, it's about 60 feet under frozen ground. And in order to dig through the frozen ground, they had to thaw it. So every night they would build fires in what would be their mining shaft, and then in the morning they could dig a couple feet of dirt out. And they said that Bonanza Creek, lit up by these fires with the smoke hanging in the valley, looked like the fires of Hades.
I took in over $100,000 from those claims, and I spent every red cent buying more. I worked mostly on my own. Haven't had time for marriage. Men are a nuisance anyway, aren't they? They're just boys grown up. I've nursed them, embalmed them, scolded them, and you have to treat them just like little boys.
Whereas men were the undoing of both Molly and Belinda, Nellie Cashman, she always stayed away from any entanglement with men. There was never a hint of impropriety in any of her relations with men. And, the evidence wasn't hard to find of what happened when you were entangled with men. And it was difficult to judge their character, and there were so many ways they could bring you down.
Molly Walsh still enjoyed male company. She got on so well with miners that some said she was a different kind of gold digger, and that Mike Bartlett was where she intended to stake her claim. Mike was a drinking, gambling man with a reputation for the ladies. She first met Mike at her grub tent on the mountain trail into the Klondike.
Mike Bartlett at one time was worth $100,000. This is a tall, young, mustachioed, good-looking, solid, probably well-spoken sort of person who was obviously becoming extremely successful in his business.
The Bartlett brothers ran a lucrative trade running mining gear into the Klondike.
But there were other suitors as well.
Molly was also being wooed by packer Jack Newman, one of Bartlett's business rivals.
I remember Molly operated a primitive eating place with only a sheet iron stove and a narrow lunch counter. The eats weren't special, but Molly's enthusiasm and quick wit made her a favorite with all the miners.
Packer Jack met Molly in Skagway, and he pursued her. She would flirt with him, according to Packer Jack.
When Newman pushed Molly to choose her suitor, she chose Mike Bartlett. Newman was devastated.
Molly was angry. She said I wasn't her master not being married to her. Hers was a public eating place, so anyone in the whole Northland was welcome. One thing led to another, and neither of us would weaken. Then Molly up and married the skunk.
It's hard to say what the nature of the relationship was. On December the 11th, 1898, not even 6 months after she arrived in Dawson, they were married.
Mr. Mike Bartlett quietly married Miss Molly Walsh on Sunday. The bride looked charming in white silk and pink roses. The evening was spent in toasts and song. The Bartletts received a number of costly wedding presents.
But Mike's brother, Ed, was not convinced of the love match.
Molly wanted to marry Mike for his money, and I didn't trust her. My brother was too easily led around by women.
It was a forced marriage. There seems little doubt. Molly Walsh was 4 to 4.5 months pregnant when she married Mike Bartlett. Whether the pregnancy was planned by her, it seems to me with that information that it's no wonder that the family perhaps saw her as a gold digger.
Belinda's high-rolling life was strictly of her own making. Her hotel and real estate empire grew alongside her success in mining.
I think I enjoyed prospecting most of anything. I felt I'd conquered it.
Eventually, she became the manager of the largest mining conglomerate in all of the Yukon Territory.
But success highlighted a growing sense of loneliness. In Dawson, there were plenty of men who would have obliged a woman like Belinda with a proposal.
I had friends and business partners, but I was still unmarried. I hate to admit it, but it must have been lonesome.
Belinda's the Fairview Hotel became the place in Dawson for anyone of any class. And one day, in walks a man. This man is very well dressed.
The man's name was Count Charles Eugene Carbonneau. His grand manner caught Belinda's curiosity straight away.
I came into the hotel after a tiresome day and heard the manager arguing with the man about the price of wine. I was disgusted. Let him have it, I said. Charge the bottle to me. The man had just arrived from London with an option on a mine. Even if he didn't want to be overcharged for the wine, he wanted me to understand. He wasn't cheap.
I think Belinda's intrigued by him, actually. He's complex, and I think she's sort of drawn in by the challenge.
Still in Dawson, things were going badly for the Bartletts. Mike was drinking and gambling away most of their money. There were even rumors that Mike had been violent and that Molly had turned to one of his business partners, a man named John Lynch.
It's not hard to imagine someone watching her husband fall into alcoholism and giving away their investments to share these problems with another person, and that person to be compassionate and to show compassion.
There were a lot of abusive relationships at the time in America. She was caught in one.
Eventually, Molly escaped with Lynch, taking most of Mike's money and the child. Despite warnings from friends and business associates, Belinda took a gamble on love and married Eugene Carbonneau.
Under Canadian law, and would have been United States law at that time also, a woman's status as a business person really changed dramatically when she married. Her identity in the legal system was merged with that of her husband, and in that merger, the husband had precedent.
Of course, my friends were nervous. You can see how they would distrust the owner of a silk tie and title.
But it wasn't long before Belinda's millions were frittered away in one of Carbonneau's financial scams.
Charles ends up investing a lot of Belinda's money in his own schemes.
And the fraud was further compounded when Carbonneau was exposed as only a Montreal barber on the make.
In the course of about 4 or 5 years, Belinda no longer has a fortune. A lot of the things that Charles was involved in smack of fraud. This really hurts Belinda. And being connected with someone whose reputation turns out really questionable is something that I think she has a hard time dealing with.
Yesterday appeared before the correctional chamber a crook of wide range. Charles Eugene Carbonneau, having handled millions, launched resounding speculations. The unfortunate ran afoul of the police court under the charge of abuse of confidence. He is a debauchee and libertine.
But nevertheless, she solved the problem. She divorced him. And I don't know how she resolved that with her Catholic upbringing, but I believe she probably did it for legal reasons so that he wouldn't have any claim on her money, because she never married again.
Change was in the air across Alaska and the Yukon. As the century turned, the Klondike rush petered out. Big mining companies moved in to buy up individual claims. But gold was discovered in other parts of Alaska, and Nellie Cashman was on the trail north once again, this time to prospect on the edge of the Arctic Circle.
This was a place remote, ice cold, huge amounts of snow periodically, very, very treacherous rivers, creeks. It was a tough life.
In 1907, I went north to the Kayuk territory. I had a funny experience going down the river on a raft. If you know anything about that river, you know how many rocks there are and how swift the rapids. In any event, coming down through some swift water, we struck rock that wrecked our craft. There's always something interesting happening up north.
Belinda Mulrooney was still a young woman when she left Alaska. After her divorce, she built a second fortune and retired to a mansion near Seattle. Over the next 40 years, she ran a farm and dabbled in real estate. During the 1940s and well into her 70s, Belinda even worked in a munitions factory to aid the war effort.
I think there are a lot of examples that we have, especially from literature, of women from the 1800s who tried to do unusual things and were squashed for various reasons. Belinda was squashed again and again, but she kept going. I think that's a wonderful example for women nowadays.
Belinda Mulrooney, born in the west of Ireland in 1872. Died on the west coast of America in 1967, aged 95. The best years of her life, she always claimed, were those spent in the Gold Mountains of Alaska. And what of Molly Walsh? With Mike Bartlett in pursuit, she traveled up and down the Pacific coast. Then, Mike got word that Molly was living in Seattle.
Witnesses testified to seeing Bartlett a short time after he arrived in Seattle in a badly used-up condition. His face was swollen, his eyes glassy and staring. Every hair on his head was an emblem of grief.
My husband abused me in all ways he could devise, calling names only nature could suggest, and often threatened to make away with my very existence. My husband in his day killed a man, though I alone knew it.
A week later, Mike returned to the hotel. A row erupted. Mike was seen chasing Molly into an alleyway.
She'd been shot several times through the back of the head and one through the heart. The husband then turned the gun on himself and only gave himself a flesh wound to the forehead. She was dead and taken to Butterworth's mortuary, and he was taken to jail, mumbling incoherently.
At the end of a year-long trial, Mike Bartlett was acquitted of the murder of Molly Walsh. But Mike was never free. After years in a Seattle asylum, he wandered the north, aimless. Finally, unable to cope with his guilt, Mike Bartlett hanged himself. But one man never forgot Molly. The packer, Jack Newman, built a memorial to Molly in Skagway. The inscription reads, "Alone, this courageous girl ran a grub tent during the gold rush of 1898. She fed the wildest gold-crazed men. Generations shall surely know this inspiring spirit. Murdered October 27th, 1902.
I admire this woman. I like it that she's not really an angel of the White Pass Trail, but a human being, but nevertheless a very special human being who deserves our respect.
And Nellie Cashman, still on her own, still prospecting near the Arctic Circle, still mushing huskies well into her 70s, Nellie kept to the mining until the day she died.
Last week, I came over the mountains on a fast dog train, and the sled only turned over once. I had a little roll in the snow, but I'm travelling light, and I'm feeling fine after the long trip. I'm still a long way from the cushion rocker stage. Those prospectors up north need me, and that is the country I expect to live out the rest of my days.
Well, let me put it this way. I'm a mining historian, and I've done a lot of research in most parts of the world for many, many decades, and I've come across many personalities, male, female, young, old, and in many ways she is head and shoulders above them because of her long commitment, her sense of decency, and her continual drive to succeed and to share. And I know of no other person in my historical research experience that compares to that.
Nellie Cashman is an unparalleled woman of the West who was everywhere in the West. She never took no for an answer. She did exactly what she wanted to do. She would let no one stand in her way, whether it was the Mounties or any kind of authorities that said, you can't go there, you can't do this. She went, she did it. I think the Irish women really brought a sense of spunk to the entrepreneurial aspects of Alaska. They had been raised to think that they would be working, and these three women in particular thought of new ways to apply those traditional skills that, you know, you might be waitressing, you might be running a restaurant in a hotel, you might be running a boarding house, but you know, you could make so much more money running a boarding house in the Klondike and mining for gold in your spare time. That's what I love about the stories of the many women that went on their own as entrepreneurs. Now that's something that a lot of young women today can really identify with.
On her deathbed in 1925, Nellie was being nursed in one of the frontier hospitals she helped to build. She still spoke of going north to reach her goal, which wasn't so much gold. She gave most away. It was the lure of adventure and a life she might not have lived had she not taken the gamble to go it alone in the new world of the American West.
I've suffered hardships in the frozen plains of Alaska and in the deserts of Arizona. I've been alone all my life, but I've been happy. And that is why I'm not afraid to tell you I am mighty apt to make $1 million or $2 before I leave this romantic business of mining.